Hello class, this is the lecture for Goldhouse and Goldstein and Peevehouse Chapter 6 on military force and terrorism. A couple of things. The first is that you should see some grades over the weekend, and you also have an assignment that's due over the next 48 hours. It is a hypothetical situation. I want you to take the last two lectures. I want you to look at some of the tactics, some of the strategies that exist from these lectures, and talk about how a state would behave when it's intervening in another state practice. Remember that in every question, you're trying to show me gradable material. So it's not what is the best policy, right? It is what is the best policy from the material that we have covered. Make sure to avoid normative statements and demonstrate that you've read the material, gone through the lectures, and understood the concepts that we've covered in the last couple of weeks. Specifically this week. So when we're talking about military force and terrorism, remember that we have two different types of options as states. Now the first option is a diplomatic option. Diplomatic options involve a lot of behaviors, and I'm going to go through them a little quickly. We're not going to deal with them right now because we actually go through them a little more during the International Political Economy section, which is the last section of the course. Now you have trade regulations. Remember, these are carrots and sticks, right? These are benefits and punishments, and trade regulations can be favored nation status, right? This is how China becomes a trade partner with the United States. We say, we're going to give you a deal that's better than other states, and this favored nation status means that you're going to get better trade deals with the US, you're going to have lower tariffs, you're going to have lower taxes of imports and exports. So this favored nation status is a way for one state to say we're going to be better trade partners, right? It's a very diplomatic process. The next is tax and monetary policy. Now, the most obvious historical example is the Marshall Plan. We wanted these states to develop, and we wanted these states to develop a very specific way as a capitalist society. So you can use your monetary policy to invest in states and encourage them to develop their capitalist economies, encourage them to develop their infrastructure, but you can also use these things as the Marshall Plan did to say, okay, we're going to loan you money, and then in exchange, you're going to develop your system with a little better civil liberties. Remember that the money and the sort of the making of the money was not the only goal of the United States during the Marshall Plan. It was also to influence the infrastructure and the institutions of these states. We also have these diplomats, these individuals, and personal diplomacy. That's something we'll talk about later in the course, right? But it's just the individual's ability to be charismatic, to discuss topics, and to find common ground. But it involves a lot of literature that we don't cover in this course. The next part is norms, right? These norms of sovereignty, right? Do you invade, do you not invade, but also other norms of human rights. We talked about the responsibility to protect in the exam, right? Responsibility to protect creates this obligation, this new norm that your state has to take care of its people. So these norms can be very influential. When you have two states that share norms, you can say, you should probably stop this behavior because it violates norms that we both hold. And sometimes that can be influential. It just depends on the behavior and the interests of the state. We also have international organizations, which we'll talk about when we cover that chapter, right? What rules do they create? What norms do they create? How can they help ease this process? We have foreign aid. So sometimes foreign aid can be very influential. We talked about this earlier in the semester, where the difference between Egypt and other states in the region is that Egypt made a peace agreement with Israel, and because of that peace agreement, right, in exchange for that, there's a lot of military and monetary aid that goes to those two states. So you can use money in different ways. It can be aid, it can be policy, and then you always have economic sanctions. Now, economic sanctions can be an embargo where you say nothing from that state is supposed to come to this state, or it can just be raising the tariffs dramatically, right? You have to pay a lot more, which means that that product is going to sell less in your state, right, in this process. So these are diplomatic options. We are going to assume, right, that when we're talking about after diplomatic options, we always want to think that diplomatic options come first, right? They're a longer process. They might be ongoing during a conflict, but now we're going to talk about military options. And military options work differently than diplomatic options because they occur in a shorter timetable. Right, diplomatic options are always ongoing, but military options are short term, right, and they are very costly. So we'll talk about them as we move forward. So you always have the military as an option, right? We're talking about states right now, right? And it's very important that we focus on what states do because non-state actors have a bunch of reasonings and rationales for their behavior that aren't connected to the state. So if you're a state, right, you always have your Army, your Navy, and your Air Force. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about those. You also have irregular forces, and irregular forces could be commandos. And the reason why this is sort of dashed out this way, why you have this forward slash there, is because if you have a commando, another grouping might consider them a terrorist, right? What's a freedom fighter versus which is a terrorist? And it always depends on whose side you're on, right? In Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, the precursor to the Taliban, right, were funded and supported by the United States. So during that time, right, those are commandos, those are irregular forces, those are allied with the United States. We would not call them terrorists, but we taught them to engage in guerrilla warfare. We taught them to engage in harassment attacks against the Russians. So the Russians would consider them terrorists. So we're talking about a commando versus a terrorist versus a guerrilla fighter. Those are defined based on whose side you're on. If you're on the same side, then those are irregular forces. If those are opponents, right, you can often call them terrorists. We'll actually talk about terrorists more, but we know this is not well defined, right? What it means to be a terrorist is not exceptionally well defined. But we're going to give it a definition so we can have a shared language. The other part is weapons of mass destruction. Now, we've talked about nuclear weapons before, right? They have a deterrent effect. If you're a state and there's another state that has a nuclear weapon, you're less likely to intervene or invade because that weapon is sort of devastating. It's a force multiplier. But chemical and biological weapons have a different focus. They're very easy to make, they're very cheap to make, and for a long time there was no ban on stockpiling. So states built up a big stockpile of biological and chemical weapons, and then they all agreed to not use them. And then you had some violations of that agreement, right, where you violate this norm because you can effectively control a population very easily with these. It's not a good against a standing military, but when you have a population, right, that is sort of working against what you want, these weapons are very effective. Now, I say effective in that they kill a lot and maim a lot of people. There's a normative aspect of these weapons that we're not going to get into. So when it seems I'm being very cavalier about them, it has nothing to do with that. It's just that we're trying to focus on the science of this, and if we get sort of bogged down into the normative aspects of these weapons, we won't get through the material. So despite these being short-term, despite these being only if diplomatic options fail, the majority of resources go to military options because they are so costly, right? Personal diplomacy, very, very cheap. Tanks and aircraft carrier, very, very expensive. So the majority of resources have to go to military options because you're worried about national defense and you're worried about intervening and being able to enforce policy. So it's a very expensive process, but it serves two different goals. So let's talk about conventional forces. We're going to talk about the Army first because the Army has two different pieces, right? You have the infantry and the armor. So the infantry is sort of lightly armed soldiers. We're talking about M16s, AK-47s, right? Small arms fire. They are trained, right? The difference between an infantryman and a sort of just a person in a militia is that the infantryman is highly trained. They're trained in weapon usage, they're trained in hierarchy, chain of command, right? They know what to do, they know how to follow orders, right? We expect a different behavior from someone in the infantry than someone who is in a militia or someone who's a terror cell. Armor are just the vehicles that have protection from light arms. So this can be a tank, this could be an armored personnel carrier, this could be anything that has some protection from light arms. The reason we're going to make this definition will be very clear later when we're talking about terror groups, and we've talked about this a little in the last section, right? Why do we care so much about rough terrain? Why does Spearon care about rough terrain? It's because armored vehicles have a difficulty getting through rough terrain. If you're in a mountain, you are protected from tanks because tanks, by their weight, by the fact that they're tracked vehicles, they're going to struggle to get through mountains. So you don't have as much to deal with in armor in that process. Why does it matter? It's because the Army is the only conventional force, it's the only force generally that can occupy a territory. And we'll talk a bit about occupation as we sort of move forward. But occupation involves sort of taking over the territory, doing all of this behavior, right? You're setting up checkpoints, you are changing the daily lives of those individuals. And you need a lot of infantry individuals, usually we say infantrymen, but it doesn't really apply in the modern era. But you have this infantry, they are in the villages, in the towns, in the homes, right, patrolling the roadways, and all of these factors allow for an occupation that can only occur through an army. Now, when you have armor units, they can repel irregular forces in open terrain very easily, right? If you have tanks and the other sort of group that is fighting only has small arms, those tanks are going to win very easily. And because they're easily going to take over, right? If you have an open terrain, if you have a large landmass, and it's very easy, right? There aren't mountains, there aren't deep jungle. It's very easy for the armor to take over other forces unless they're engaging in more guerrilla warfare, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. So the army is the only force capable of occupation, but it has limits. The clear limits that we see is that this is very expensive. Putting that many sort of boots on the ground, a tank is very expensive. Tanks are millions upon millions of dollars in the United States, right? That's a different argument that you have when you do American politics, right? The tanks that we build are very, very expensive, and they typically don't get used, right? A tank is not as valuable in today's warfare as it was previously. And then the other part is the cost in human lives. Anytime you send in the army, you're going to lose soldiers, right? There was the obvious example of Kosovo where they didn't have any fatalities, but that's such a difference, it's such a rare example. Typically, when you send in armed forces, you're going to have a cost in human lives. And the other part about this is the political risk. When you send in the army, you are having these costs in human lives, and you are taking this factor as a risk for you that you may have to deal with this as moving forward. So political risks are the big part of this. A lot of elected officials and a lot of authoritarian regimes, they aren't really as concerned about the lives that are lost. They're concerned about the consequence of those lives lost, right? Remember, this isn't a normative argument. This is an empirical argument. Why do you see specifically, right, during the Vietnam era, some political officials not getting reelected is because the opposition to the war and the cost in human lives is costing this electoral process. And that's something they're concerned about. That has a lot to do with the government deciding to withdraw from Vietnam, right? Not just the normative aspects, but that we won't get reelected unless we start being against the Vietnam War. Conventional forces also have to deal with counterinsurgency, and counterinsurgency is a two-pronged approach. The one that we have become very familiar with in the United States, which is quite rare, is called winning hearts and minds. And winning hearts and minds is a psychological process where you try a bunch of different strategies to cause the domestic population to accept either the occupation, right? We're talking about Iraq 2003 to today, right? Are we trying to get the Iraqis to accept that the American forces are going to influence their domestic behavior, right? Or are we trying to convince them to not work with their rebel groups, right? If this is not a U.S. involvement case and you just have a state trying to get rid of a terrorist group or a rebel group, what are they doing? And one of them is a diplomatic process. We provide resources for some insurgents. You say, I'm not going to take on all of the groups that I'm fighting, but I'm going to pick one group and I'm going to take that group and I'm going to say, okay, you stop fighting me and I'm going to provide you with resources, right? Say you're a terrorist cell and you're very effective and I don't care about everyone, but I care about you. I'm going to pay you off, and then that way I don't have to deal with that one group, and by changing the balance of groups, other groups might fall off. The other part is public opinion campaigns, and government programs can do this either through propaganda or they can do this through providing resources. We know in the Philippines, and after some typhoons in 2013, the government provided basic resources, it helped to rebuild infrastructure, and just by being the provision of resources and the helping of the population, it changed the public's opinion of whose side they should be on. The other part is about when you have a terror group or a guerrilla group, if they start using very violent tactics, you can have the governments start making this argument that they are violating these peaceful norms, and the public will turn against that violent group and sort of reassess their attachment to the government, and they might recoalesce. And all terror groups, all rebel groups, all irregular forces, they need the domestic population to survive. They rely on sort of resources from the domestic population to survive. So you can use that as a government to provide a better alternative so that these irregular forces don't have a hiding place. The other prong is targeted attacks. So counterinsurgency involves a process called cordon and knock. So this involves also winning hearts and minds, where you go and you set up a certain area, you start knocking on doors, you ask for permission, you ask for help, right? And this has to be the army for obvious reasons. You need troops on the ground, face-to-face interaction, where you start asking the local population to work with you, but you need all this personnel so that if you do get some actionable intelligence, some ability to find someone who's part of that rebel group, right, you can have that area tightened up, and then you can pick up that person with limited effect. So that's one aspect of it, right? Target attacks also involve going to the places where they are. If you go into tunnels, right, a lot of rebel groups in Afghanistan have used tunnels. So counterinsurgency is very good at going through tunnels, right? We know that bombing doesn't work because the tunnel systems protect them from sort of aerial bombing. So you have to go into these tunnels and sort of clear them one by one. This requires specific training, right? Tunnel cleaning is very, very dangerous, so it requires a great deal of training, but also it requires a different type of behavior from the armed forces. The other part is dealing with insurgency weapons. Now, insurgency weapons are very different from normal forces weapons. Landmines are very effective because you just sort of set it up and forget, and if you're just trying to weaken a force, right, you can just set up landmines and walk away. The other one is improvised explosive devices. We saw this a lot in Iraq, right? I can't fight you face to face, right? The tanks, the armored vehicles of the US military, they're outmatching the insurgency. But if I set up these improvised explosive devices, I might make it so detrimental psychologically to the US that they might not be willing to continue this fight. Also, improvised explosive devices is very cheap, right, and very difficult for convoys to notice, right? You hide it in something and then you detonate it, right? These low-tech devices are very effective against a high-tech military. And then it creates this high-tech, low-tech divide, right? If you know the US military is monitoring your communication, instead of using radio transmitters or any sort of electronic device, you just avoid those together. You write something on a piece of paper, you give it to a motorcycle courier. We've saw this in sort of training practices in the US military, right? I know you're going to be able to collect on everything I do electronically, so I'll just give up on electronics and I'll do everything by courier. It makes it harder for command and control, but also you know, right, that the US military would be able to monitor anything you transfer electronically. So if you're on the insurgency side, you're doing this very low tech process. But if you're on the military side, the conventional forces, you have to take up this high tech side, right? So radio jammers have been one obvious example. If you're worried about an improvised explosive device, a lot of them use a cell phone transmission, right? They send a text to the phone, or they send a signal to the phone and then it detonates. So what you do is you set up all of these radio jammers, and it doesn't allow any signals to process, or it overloads any process. So any explosive that is in range would just detonate. So high-tech sources and low-tech sources are really competing in this system because of the two different types of combat forces, right? You have conventional forces on one side trying to deal with counterinsurgency, and the insurgency trying to deal with this asymmetrical power, right? So what can they do? What weapons can they use to sort of fight against a much larger and more technologically advanced force? Next, we go to naval forces. So naval forces behave very differently. The first is that they have a wartime and a peacetime role. So during wartime, right, the naval forces provide supply lines. Supply lines are very important for a military, right? You need to be able to feed, right, protect your troops, right, provide them with ammunition. So the naval forces provide all of this. We talk about like air forces maybe being part of the supply line, but the sheer magnitude requires a navy, right? You can't fly in the amount of ammunition and arms that a military uses. So a naval force is very important for this, especially today, because the amount of resources needed for a military has actually increased. So supply rights for the army, and then also blockading your enemy, right? If you're talking about two states and you want to make sure that one state cannot continue its campaign, all you have to do is cut off their resources. So if we cut off the resources of another military, especially if we think about sort of World War II and the US versus Japan, the US isolated the Japanese island and then they couldn't get as much steel or resources in. So eventually, right, Japan would have lost World War II by attrition. Right? It's just the cost in human lives would be much higher for the U.S., which is why the U.S. decided to use a nuclear weapon. We'll talk about that later. But blockade of an enemy supply right can weaken that enemy so much that they end up not making it. The other part that we know about for naval forces is this peacetime role. So a naval force, the U.S. Navy right now guarantees all shipping lanes, right? All goods delivery and shipping lanes. So you know that if you send a ship, a merchant ship, from one place in the world to another, right, that is protected by shipping lanes by the U.S. Navy. And this has sort of been accepted for a while now, right, as the British Navy sort of fell, as the British Empire declines. The U.S. Navy is in every shipping lane. So if you are a ship and you're being attacked, if it's not another state's ship, right, the U.S. Navy will step in. Often it will step in. It doesn't have to step in, but often step in because it's just better for the U.S. if shipping lanes are open. So they have this role. And we see this role and its obvious like limitations at the end of piracy, the end of modern piracy in 2012. So when the British Empire rises, it gets rid of piracy in the Caribbean. That's why you have all these movies and this sort of mythology around the Caribbean, Pirates of the Caribbean. But in the modern era, sort of in the 21st century, you see some states have really bad economic situations, specifically Somalia. So Somalia, there just aren't jobs, there aren't a lot of resources, there's a possible famine, right? Hunger's an issue. So a lot of these individuals turn to piracy, and what they do is they take small boats and they capture merchant vessels, and the merchant vessels could defend themselves, but they don't want to, right? The cost of self-defense, the arming of these merchant ships is very problematic. So what happens is you have these Somali pirates and they start taking ships and taking resources. So piracy becomes a problem in that part of the world, right? Especially in sort of that southern part of Africa going into Southeast Asia, right along that coastal line. There's a lot of shipping lanes there, the very active shipping lanes there. So you have a couple ships getting taken over, and you have the Somali government not being able to respond to it, and you have this delay from 2008 to 2012 where the US Navy isn't taking as much activity. And then you have an American ship taken over. And what happens is when you have Americans taken hostage, there's a clear normative response, right, from the US Navy. They have to protect these American individuals. And then you see the US Navy really start to decimate piracy in that area, and then in 2013 you have a lot of these individuals say it's just not worthwhile to be a pirate anymore. So this very clear example of the naval forces helping control these shipping lanes, helping to give some sort of economic normalcy to the environment. The other part, right, which is very unique to the US, is this idea of the aircraft carrier. We talked about this before, that force projection. An aircraft carrier has force projection. You can send an aircraft carrier to an area and your military now dominates that area. The US has over 100 aircraft carriers, and now we start using this language of super carriers, which are much, much larger than aircraft carriers. Whereas China has one, a few other states have one, but they're small. They can only land small airplanes or aircraft, where the aircraft carriers of the US are massive, these sort of massive ships. They can land very large aircraft, and because they have such access to where they're going, right, it's like having a base that moves and allows you a lot of control. Obviously, there are limits to a navy. The first is you cannot occupy this. We'll see this in every case except the army, right? Is that you can't occupy land. You're on sea, they're on land. You can't control their forces. The other part is inland areas. Russia has a very inland portion of their country, right, a Navy is not going to do very much. If you're more than, say, 40, 50 miles in, the Navy doesn't have a lot that it can do, right? It's very limited in what it can do as you move forward. So that's the limitation of the Navy. The Air Force involves technological superiority. We see when you in the modern conflicts with the United States is that the first thing that happens is that the Air Force destroys anything that's not guerrilla forces. If you have a tank, if you have equipment, right, that the Air Force is going to come in and destroy and sort of dominate the airspace and then eliminate anything that isn't sort of small arms fire. We see this in 1991 because the Iraq government realized that its anti-aircraft missiles needed radar to sort of pick up the aircraft. But as soon as they turned on the radar, right, the U.S. military would blow up the radar system and then blow up the missile system. So they would just not turn on the radar and they would blind fire against these ships. And blind fire just sort of been this idea that they try to predict where the aircraft would be instead of a radar system and tracking. In 1991, they don't turn on the equipment. In 2003, because it's a regime change, right, we're not just repelling their invasion of Kuwait as we did in 91. In 2003, it's an invasion, right, it's a declaration of war, right, we're trying to get rid of the regime. They start turning on their equipment, and the Air Force very quickly identifies anything that is a risk and blows it up. So you see the loss of the Iraqi Air Force and the Iraqi electronic warfare very, very quickly in 2003 and 2004. The other part that a Air Force can do is assistance to irregular forces. So in Libya, right, you had the Arab Spring, you had the sort of Libyans working against their government, right, you had the fall of the Gaddafi regime, and so part of the United States Air Force took over the airspace of Libya and prevented the Libyan government, right, the Gaddafi regime, from using its aircraft and its military technology from stopping this rebel group. So you can intervene with an air force and promote, right, irregular forces. We saw that in Libya, and we've seen this quite a few times, right? Russia did this in Syria, where they sort of intervened in the airspace of Syria, and they could have helped a rebel group sort of fight against Syrian forces, but they sided with the Syrian forces. So assistance to irregular forces can occur, but only by sort of eliminating the conventional forces advantage, right? You say, oh, you have tanks and you have aircraft, but I'm going to, as an intervening state, I'm going to say you have to deal with this small arms fire to small arms fire, which might allow a rebel group like Mujahideen in Afghanistan to win against a much larger force like the Soviets in the 1980s. The next thing is logistics and intelligence. There is no better way to control a sort of zone than through aerial reconnaissance. Aerial reconnaissance can involve everything. It's signals jamming, it's right, SIGINT, which is something I did in the Army, right, where you collect intelligence from other individuals by monitoring their communications, right? It's also logistics. You know where everyone's at, you know what everyone is doing, you know all the plans that they have. So by having this control, commanding control, you can control the battlefield more easily. You know where the enemy is going, you know what they're doing, and they don't know what you're doing. So it gives you an advantage when you have that informational asymmetry as well as that technological asymmetry. The limits are very clear, right? One, if you have a low intensity conflict, right, if you have sort of guerrilla warfare, if it's in a jungle, right, aircraft can't get to those aspects. So when you have a larger military, or if you have an interstate war, aircraft in the Air Force really matters. But when you have a low intensity conflict, a subnational conflict, right, then it matters less, right? And you have this quote in the text, right? Nobody ever surrendered to an airplane. You can't get a force to stop fighting if you're only using an air force, right? You can't get irregular forces to stop through aircraft. You at some point have to have troops on the ground, and that's a limitation of the Air Force, right? It's an exchange too, right? It's very, very inexpensive, right? Monetarily, it's very expensive, but the political risks are very low when you use an Air Force. Because of all of this advanced technology, you do see erosion of state sovereignty, right? Or you have this argument that there's erosion of state sovereignty. The first is electronic warfare. So the US did this a lot where they would jam state signals right? But technically, if we look at the declarations of war, if you engage in jamming of another state's signals, their state-run media, right? That's a declaration of war. So while we don't always recognize that in the U.S., right? This idea of jamming is a declaration of war. It's very problematic. The other part is cyber war, right? France often steals um, corporately or patent ideas from corporations in the United States, right? So electronic warfare can be this weird practice, even though France is our ally, that their corporations are stealing from our corporations and their cyber warfare is being funded by the state. Or it could be, right, the propaganda that we saw in 2016 where the Russians are using social media, right, not just hacking, right? It's not hacking, this is open source, right? So they're just logging in with an account and creating these images and these arguments to try and influence the behavior. So electronic warfare has really started to matter, and you can't defend that with a border, right? Borders don't matter when it comes to a lot of this electronics because you can cross that border very easily, right? You can send information to the United States. We can send propaganda across the world very quickly. We saw in the 90s stealth technology really matters. Stealth technology isn't as important today because when you have something like a drone, it doesn't, you're not as much at risk. We'll talk about drones in a second. But it used to be very obvious that the United States was violating sovereign airspace quite often. The development of the B-2 stealth bomber allowed the United States Air Force to go into countries without them noticing. So you would have these bombers go into countries for reconnaissance or for surgical strikes. And because of that, right, you weren't as worried about sovereignty. And then you have the drone era. The drone era just creates this huge problem because the rules were sort of written that you couldn't send a person into another state, right? I can't send my troops into your country. That's a violation of state sovereignty. But can I send my drone in? There's no one there, right? So the fact that it's an unmanned aerial vehicle means that the rules change. And so then you have this really big problem about who's violating foreign airspace. Can you send a drone without violating foreign airspace? But also because there's no person in that vehicle, right? If it's just the drone itself, right? You're not as much political risk if it gets shot down. You're worried about the technology, but not sort of secrets giving away because you can just wipe the system, right? There aren't any people involved. So this starts to become a huge problem, especially during the Obama administration. President Obama recognizes, he says that drone strikes are too easily controlled by the executive. It gives them too many options, but also they can go into a lot of countries with no consequences. So drone strikes become a very big problem starting in about 2008, 2009, because they're very effective. You can eliminate targets very easily with them, but at the same time, it erodes what it means to be a state, and the borders start to matter less when you can so easily violate them. And then the other part is this counterterrorism, right? Am I just going and striking against a terrorist, and because we have this global war on terror, we're coordinating with states, or is this an invasion where I don't respect your sovereignty and I'm going into your country without your permission, right? And how do we deal with those two different issues? So those were conventional forces, and now we're talking about irregular forces. And the most obvious example that we deal with today, that's actually less prominent than it was in 2013 when this update came out, is this idea of terrorism. So terrorism for us is going to be political violence that deliberately and indiscriminately targets civilians. So terrorism has to be the targeting of civilians. The other part is it has to attempt to demoralize civilians in order to change a policy or government. Remember that this is not about winning the war, right? You're not winning the war by gaining territory. You're trying to get an outcome that you want by making the civilian population so unhappy, so miserable, so damaged that they give you what they want, despite the fact that you are not taking control of the military. Is a calculated use of violence as leverage. So we should not think of them as irrational. We should not think of them as not following sort of a rational choice process. This is a lot of times a irregular force realizing that they cannot win through conventional means and choosing this psychological impact, right? They make it so violent that others are like, well, this could have been me. I don't want to be in this situation, so I'm just going to give this terror group what they want. Part of the problem with conventional forces is these they don't wear uniforms, and they operate across state borders. So if you are in Iraq, and the U.S. forces in Iraq realize that some of these forces are going into Syria, or they're going into Turkey to sort of hide, or they're going into Iran for protection, what do? Because you can't just invade every state in the name of terrorism. So you couldn't, U.S. forces could not go into Iran because of that state border, but terrorist forces could sort of cross that border much more easily, especially when you have more porous borders. And a lot of states have porous borders just because of the cost of border security is very limited, right? We deal with border security as an immigration issue, but a lot of other states are dealing with this from the perspective of terrorist groups, right? How easily can those groups cross, and how difficult it is when you, as a conventional military, can't cross that border because it would be a declaration of war. Terrorism has had very limited success. So Lebanon in 1983 is supposedly argued as a sort of terror success, right? You have the U.S. sort of remove itself. You have Lebanon change its policy. You have states change their policy, but we'll talk about whether or not that's true. But in terrorism in the Iraq War, right, you did not see terror groups be very successful. There was a lot of human lives cost, but you do have eventually the sort of elimination, right? The terror groups typically don't get the outcome that they want. The other problem with Lebanon in 1930, the example is the Khobar Towers. So you had a group back up a truck to a Marine base, right? Khobar Towers was the sort of a building where military personnel, American military personnel, were housed. The truck blows up, right, and it kills a lot of personnel, right? And then Ronald Reagan is president at the time, and he removes his forces because the public starts thinking, I don't care about Lebanon. I don't care about the people in Lebanon. I don't care about people in that part of the world, right? So you have this argument, but that's not terrorism. It's not terrorism because the target was a military target. Remember, terrorism has to be civilians that are being targeted. So whether or not terrorism is really successful is problematic because the only case they point to has a lot to do with a military target, and it has a lot to do with the Reagan era and then just not being concerned with those individuals that are not sort of white American ethnocentric group, right? Remember that Reagan era had a lot of racial tension, and so Americans might have been arguing, why are we even here in the first place? We don't care about those people, right? So Khobar Towers is, why are we giving up the lives of Americans for a people that we don't care about? The other part is that you always violate norms when you become a terrorist, right? The targeting of civilians violates norms. And when you violate a norm, right, you have to deal with the different types of norms. State norms is very different from non-state norms. And we'll talk about this as we continue forward. But realistically, the bigger part is just that states and individuals have different norms, and individuals don't have to hold to the norms of states. We've talked about state-sponsored terrorism, right? State-sponsored terrorism is just the fact that you are a terror group, but you're getting resources from a state that wants you to change policy or just wants you to inflict harm so that whoever the other actor is spending resources on the terror group rather than the state that they're dealing with, right? Iran has funded terror groups not because they necessarily wanted that terror group's outcome, but because that terror group was causing a lot of problems for other governments in the region, and those state resources were directed to the terror group rather than Iran. So weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons deter invasion, right? If you are a weak state and you are being attacked by a much stronger military, you might use the nuclear weapons and say, if you continue to oppress on our territory, we're going to use this weapon and we're all going to lose, right? So it deters invasion because of that force multiplier, but it's a highly complex process, right? It's very easy to transport a weapon, but it's very hard to make a weapon. And then there's a problem of understanding. Uranium-235 is the radioactive isotope of uranium that is used to make these weapons. Yellow cake uranium is just ground up uranium, right? And uranium is a very common material. It's not that rare, right? Uranium in general is not that common. It's not radioactive either. You have to process a lot, and we're not going to get into how to make a nuclear weapon in this course, but it takes a lot of processing to take uranium, which is just a mineral, and turn it into a radioactive isotope. But in 2003, right, they had yellow cake uranium was used against the Iraqi government to say they were trying to build a nuclear weapon. But every country in the world has uranium. It's very common. It's like saying they had iron in their country, right? Every country has iron in their soil. Every country has uranium in their soil. So we don't understand this process very well, and what matters is that we are very concerned with it because of the detriment that it would cause and how much damage, the catastrophic damage it would do. But at the same time, we don't understand it that well. So it's very easy to use this argument to get what you want if you're a state because the public doesn't understand the process. And I encourage you to look up some of this stuff because, right, how we understand nuclear weapons and how we interact with them in policy is very, very different. We do have a non-proliferation treaty. In the post-World War II era, right, most countries signed a non-proliferation treaty. We have two notable exceptions, Pakistan and India. Pakistan and India have nuclear arms. They have a standoff between the two of them because of this, right? They both have nuclear weapons. They did not sign the non-proliferation treaty, and because they didn't sign the treaty, the U.S. and other powers don't respond to the same way as they do Iran and North Korea. Right, Iran and North Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also, right, there are some historical and cultural aspects that are engaged here, where the treatment of Iran and North Korea is different for a reason that we see obvious from Pakistan and India. But Iran and North Korea did at one point sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means they won't develop their own weapons-grade material for nuclear arms, but in exchange, they're supposed to have access to civilian use of this, right? That's why Iran has such a has a nuclear medicine program, is because they said, we're not going to develop arms, but we are going to develop sort of a medicinal use process for this. So you have these two different things. States dealing with this is very different from non-state actors. Remember, we talked about the difference in norms. A state is very concerned about using a nuclear weapon because of the detriment to human lives, because of the violation of norms. Non-state actors don't have the same restriction. They might intentionally use a nuclear weapon on a civilian population because it violates the norms, because it's so shocking to one population that it might get the policy outcome that they want. Chemical and biological weapons, the use of both is banned in the international system, but as I talked about earlier, you could stockpile. For a long period of time, you could stockpile. So a lot of states stockpiled these. There were two notable violations, but the problem with chemical and biological weapons is they're not great when it comes to conventional forces. Conventional forces have gear, they can protect themselves. What we saw is in Iraq and Syria, right, in the 90s, and then in the Syrian civil war, is that these weapons are usually targeting domestic populations, right? They're very cheap to make. They're very effective at domestic populations, right? They kill thousands of people with just one release. So if you're trying to control your domestic population through violence, through fear, right, this is very effective. And that's why we're not getting into the stormed aspects, because it's horrific to use this on your population. We see Saddam Hussein doing this to the Kurds before in the 90s and the 80s and 90s, right? Saddam Hussein gasses the Kurds to try and get them in line, to get them to stop setting up their own government. And then in Syria, the rebel groups, chemical weapons are used on the Syrian rebels. For both of these, it's very problematic, but we don't see this as much when we're talking about an interstate war. It's more about subnational conflict, and because it's a very effective way to control a population, and because it has that psychological effect, right? Dying is one thing, right? Getting shot and dying is one thing, but your fear of being burned alive or dying from a chemical attack is very different, because it's so painful and so horrific, right, that you'd be much more concerned about that process, and because of that, you might be more willing to get in line with the government. So subnational conflict is more likely to see chemical and biological weapons than interstate war. When it comes to all of these, when it comes to nuclear weapons, to chemical weapons, to biological weapons, states are very concerned about proliferation. And proliferation is just the spread of this technology, or the spread of these arms. And so great powers always want to limit other states from gaining this information. Now, great powers, I mean the United States, the Soviet Union, sort of the British Empire before the 20th century, or leading up into the World War II. But great powers don't want other states to have this technology because it gives them an advantage. That's one type of proliferation. The other type of proliferation that's universally agreed upon by states, right? All the states agree that non-state actors should not have access to certain weapons. You have to prevent non-state actors to having nuclear weapons and having chemical weapons because they have different norms and because norm violation is so likely when it comes to non-state actors that they would use it on a civilian population. And it is so catastrophic for these weapons to be used on a civilian population that it's very important that you prevent them, the non-state actors, from understanding how to make these weapons and how to access these weapons is very, very important. So you want to prevent access and you want to prevent them from understanding the technology. So most individuals would not know how to make a chemical weapon. All states know how to make a chemical weapon. So you want to make sure that these scientists are not being co-opted by non-state actors. And usually scientists are very costly, so regular forces can't bring in a scientific grouping, which gives a little bit of a barrier, but it's not a permanent barrier, and there are ways to get around it. The next part is military economics. So the US is one of the few states that actually benefits economically from the sale of arms, right? We sell a lot of munitions, a lot of firearms, a lot of bullets, right? The US exports a lot of arms and is part of the economy and is part of this military industrial complex in the United States, right? We spend billions of dollars on the military, so the economy is tied to the military industrial complex, but also, right, because this economy is so large, if we were to have a sustained global peace, right, part of this industrial complex would collapse. So there is a push to sort of spend and use this military defense consistently to keep the economy going. The other part is that defense and welfare spending are at odds. Every dollar I spend on a tank is a dollar I can't be spending on subsidies. And subsidies could be providing heating subsistence for people who live in poverty in colder climates. It can be food banks. It can be any resources that we're giving to individuals, right, to help them live. Every dollar I spend in defense takes away from that. Now, the US has a lot of money, so it can spend on defense and it can spend on welfare resources. That's actually not the problem in the US, but every other state has this as a much larger problem. If I spend $1 on a military equipment, a piece of military equipment, that's going to take away from these subsidies. And then the last part is the long-term effects. So we see this, why is the Marshall Plan implemented after World War II? Because the war had destroyed the entire productive capacity of Europe, right? So all of Europe's infrastructure, all of its manufacturing base had been destroyed, and that's one of the long-term effects. When you have a war, right, if we look at the Syrian civil war, most of that manufacturing base, most of that infrastructure was destroyed, which means it's going to take decades for them to get back where they were before the civil war. So it's not just eventually we'll get back to normal, it's that you're always delayed, your economy is always worse in the long term after a war, right? And you take in that consequence, that long-term effect, that wars damage your economy over the long run, if you have them in your own population, right? The US exports war, and we won't talk about this at this point, right? But the wars are outside of that soil, so you have this different economic aspect. When a war is on your soil, it damages your economy for decades and generations. Military control is very different, right? So you have a hierarchy and a chain of command, but it creates a couple of issues. The first is if you have a military, will it refuse orders? And we saw this in the Arab Spring in Egypt, right? You had the military being ordered to fire on civilians, but the military had always had a special status in Egypt, and they refused to fire on civilians. And when they refused to fire on civilians, it made the authoritarian regime that existed, the Mubarak regime, unable to control its population. This becomes the second problem, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is who answered, how do the troops answer to the state leader? Do the troops say, okay, you're the leader, you're the commander-in-chief, we all follow you? Or as we see in 2014, right, with El-Sisi, right, do the troops answer to the generals first, right? And this is this issue of civilian supremacy. In the United States, all generals, all military personnel answer the commander-in-chief, who is a civilian. They are not part of the military. This is civilian supremacy. The military answers to civilians. In Egypt in 2014, the military did not answer to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood gets elected after the Arab Spring in Egypt, right? The military decides that they don't want to follow, right? The leaders of the military, right, specifically General Sisi, does not want to follow the policies of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so you have essentially sort of a bloodless coup where the Egyptian military takes over because the generals are not following the civilian leadership, right? Egypt did not have civilian supremacy. The United States does have civilian supremacy. So this is an important concept. We're talking about the difference of how do you follow your chain of command. And of course, this is conventional forces. Irregular forces don't have this clear chain of command. One of the problems of this is that you will see a coup. A coup d'etat just means a blow to the government in French, right? That you take over a government through a coup, and then you end up with a military government. The generals and the military forces take charge, but when you have a military government, what you don't have is legitimacy. So the public doesn't see your government as legitimate, and then it takes a lot of time for this legitimacy to come into place. Now, Sisi gets elected in Egypt, right? Maybe over the last 5 years, he's 5 or 6 years, he's demonstrated that he can be a democratic leader, right? But the level of legitimacy and a clear and unfettered election is not the same for El-Sisi as it is for other places. So that's all of the stuff we covered today. Remember that you do have an assignment to do over the next 2 days. I noticed only about 13 people watch this, so make sure you're watching these. Those of you who are watching, hopefully you're getting a lot of benefit from it. The slides are posted. We will do a slight review before the next exam. Make sure to go over this before taking the assignment. Thank you for watching.